viewers, you are welcome to our program, Eyewitness. As you are aware by now, Eyewitness is a program that looks at Nigeria from a different perspective, rather than the assumption that everybody who is a member of the elite is corrupt, is engaged in self-service, self-aggrandizement. We promote here conversations with Nigerians who have a strong sense of the public interest, of public good, of community service, people who have devoted their lives to tell a different narrative and to live a different life in Nigeria. And that's the importance of what we try to do in this program. Our topic today is one that's very important to the Nigerian nation. We're looking at the discipline of history, making the argument that it's a public good. As a political scientist, I'm aware that every nation takes its history seriously. They construct it in a way to promote that nation among citizens, to create an identification between the citizen and the nation, and to make sure as citizens are born, grow, and develop, they have that bond with the nation, are ready to fight for it, to defend it. Nigeria is maybe a different story. For a long time, we have not even taken the teaching of history seriously. We discontinued it for years before, following calls by Nigerians of goodwill, there's a decision to come back to the teaching of history. I have no idea whether that comeback has occurred, but to lead us in this discussion today, we have a major historian who will expand on this theme and help educate us on history as a public good. His name is Kyari Mohammed. He's currently the Vice Chancellor of the Army University in Biu. I'm not sure that's the exact name. Previously, he was the Vice Chancellor of the Adama Modibo University in Yola. His records speak for himself. Professor Kyari, you are welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
I think the first thing we do in this program is you introduce yourself to the viewers. Let's start with your background, primary education, secondary education, where, what memories?
Okay, thank you very much. You've already in part introduced me. My name again is still Kyari Mohammed. I was born in a very rural setting in a village called Abadam on the Nigeria-Niger border in Abadam local government area of Borno State on the 6th day of June of 1963. I had my primary education in a public primary school between 68 and 74, from where I proceeded to a community secondary school in Monguno, which later became the government secondary school Monguno, between 75 and 79. So basically, I had all of my education in my local community, from where I proceeded to the University of Maiduguri between 1981 and 1984, where I graduated with a bachelor's degree in history. Subsequently, I was engaged by my alma mater as a graduate assistant, And then, of course, I was trained at the University of Ibadan, both for my master's and PhD degrees in the Department of History of the University of Ibadan. The choice of Ibadan, I'm not sure if I chose to go to Ibadan, but my teachers in Maiduguri, especially my head of history and the dean of my faculty, Professor Akinjide Oshuntokun, was himself an Ibadan product. So he literally introduced us to the Ibadan School of History, which was the nationalist school that helped to deconstruct colonialist historiography, and insist that Africa has a history of its own. So I ended up in Ibadan primarily because of the influence of Professor Oshuntokun, who brought virtually all the big name historians, the Obaro Ekimes and the Adi Ajais, Michael Crowther, all of them to Maiduguri, either for public lectures or as part of the annual Congress of the Historical Society of Nigeria. So when I decided to go for postgraduate training, Ibadan for me, was the choice, and it looks like I have no regrets for going to Ibadan without, of course, without demeaning any school of history, in any of our institutions in this country. So basically, I'm a product of the public school system, from primary school to the university. One, because as at the time I was growing up, the private educational system itself was literally unknown, primarily because the public system worked. Primary schools were good, secondary schools were good. Primary schools were fee-paying at my time, but the fees were not beyond the income of my not very rich parents. In terms of secondary schools were literally free in the 70s when I attended them, because I attended them throughout the 70s. So for my university education, I was on government scholarship, even though university education itself was literally free. And then I was a fellow of the University of Maiduguri, my alma mater, and employee while at the University of Ibadan. So my local education in my native Borno and my expose to Ibadan in the southwest, for me, literally opened Nigeria to me. Lest I forget, I did my NYSC in River State. So, and of course, that was the first time I traveled, the farthest I traveled from Maiduguri to Port Harcourt. And then I found myself in Ibadan. So that is like I've gone from one end of Nigeria to its most south end and to its most southwest end in a very short span of time, interacted with. And I have made friends and acquaintances across the length and breadth of this country. It might interest you to know that I saw Port Harcourt and Ibadan, and it took me another, God knows, maybe 20 years or more before I was able to see Sokoto or Mina. So the lesson for me in all of this is that Nigeria is a very big, vast, highly heterogeneous country. I've met good people in all parts of the country. It has also debunked some of the stereotypes I've had growing up about people from other parts of the country, people not of my ethnic group, people not of my religious persuasion, but people who have treated me very well as a human being and who have taken me based on the content of my character and my personal interaction with them, rather than, my tongue or my faith.
Well, Professor Mohammed, you must have a regret. You never went to the greatest school of history, which is the Ahmadu Bello University School of History.
Yes, I have no regrets. I didn't go to Ahmadu Bello because we see Ahmadu Bello University History Department itself as a child of the Ibadan School, because the founders of Ahmadu Bello were all faculty members who developed the Ibadan School of History, who came to Ahmadu Bello in 1962 to start the department. I'm talking about, the likes of Abdullahi Smith and so on and so forth. So,
Okay, I will not pursue that line. I'm going to change the subject. I'm an ABU fundamentalist and I don't like the direction you are going. But before coming to the main theme of the teaching of history, just looking back on your life, I knew you as a young radical scholar. Subsequently, I knew you as an ASU militant, and you are as militant as ASU ever came. And I was a bit surprised when you became Vice Chancellor of Adamu Modibo University. And subsequently today, you are Vice Chancellor of a military university. You must have changed completely. This is not the young radical I knew years ago.
yeah, I will concede on that. The young man of the early and mid 80s is, of course, not the same man of, let's say, 2014 when I became Vice Chancellor. But not much has taken place, not much change has taken place in terms of substance. My activism or militancy was basically a questioning of the status quo, an attempt to say that things are not as they should be and that they can be better. So whether outside of ASU, in the civil society, or the Nigerian left, or in ASU, basically the message was Nigeria is not working. In ASU, it is not working, especially for the public education system, and that things can be better. Now, I found myself as a Vice Chancellor, I have a feeling more by accident than by design. Because after the ASU struggles of the early 90s, particularly 1992, the law for the appointment of Vice Chancellors had taken some change. Now, Vice Chancellors will be appointed by the governing councils of the universities and not in Lagos or Abuja by the visitor, who is the head of state. So, given our track record of activism and consistency in asking for good governance in the university system, it was not surprising when the vacancy for Vice Chancellor became available that some of our colleagues within the university system thought it's wise that we should give it a try. Okay, fine, you are the critics, you are the ones insisting that things are not working, give it a try, let's see. And I'm happy to tell you that I don't think our colleagues have regretted our attempt to go into university governance, because all we tried to do was to build a model of good governance for the university system, ensure that teaching and learning took place with the limited resources available to the Vice Chancellors, ensure that there was participation by a wider spectrum of the society in terms of ensuring that the clearly laid down committees, both statutory and ad hoc works for the university. So we were, if you want to, theories being pushed into practice. No, not what you say, but do it, let's see. And I can assure you that our colleagues in the local university where we superintended for the short period still believe that we have done fairly well, because we saw ourselves not as the lords of the manor that vice chancellors are, but literally as primus inter pares, a first among equals rather than. So, and for all the period that I was vice chancellor, I was still teaching. I was still taking at least my postgraduate classes, and I was available to supervise graduate students. So for us, the vice chancellorship was a temporary assignment to come back to do your academic work. Now, as to my job in the Nigerian Army University BU, I finished my tour of duty in Yola in June of 2019. And this same 2019, I had taken up sabbatical at the Arewa House of the Ahmadu Bello University because I was engaged in a book project on my work on the Boko Haram insurgency with a view to doing my DEX research in Arewa House. And then I already had some engagement with some Western European universities for a short stay to write up. But again, the governing council of the newly established Nigerian Army University decided to literally headhunt me into taking up the job of the vice chancellor. Having been vice chancellor for 5 years, knowing the problems associated with universities, the underfunding of universities, the difficulty with the management of industrial unions in the universities, the problems, of students, I was happy to go back to my teaching and research. But then, once I was approached by the Nigerian Army University BU to set up a new university from the ground up, I also saw that as further contribution to the development of my community and an experiment in building a civilian university with a military flavor, because the Army University is basically a conventional federal university promoted by the Nigerian Army, bearing the brand of the Nigerian Army, with 70% of its students coming from civil population, while 30% of the admission is reserved for military personnel or children and wards of military personnel or orphans whose parents who are orphaned because their parents were killed in action in the numerous conflicts across the country. In terms of our faculty, again, we have both civilian and military personnel. But as the head of the institution, being a civilian as the head of the institution makes things a little easy for me, because the command structure of the military makes the management of the institution a little easier than a conventional university where every instruction is questioned by your colleagues, whether in Senate, or in the larger congregation or by the unions. So the Army University for us is an experiment, and it is part of our service to our community.
Thank you, Professor Kyari. We need to go now to our main theme, which is the teaching of history. Why is the teaching of history important?
Teaching of every subject is important, especially for a developing country like ours. But teaching of history is even more important because history teaches you basically where you are coming from, and an understanding of your past will light the direction as to where you ought to go. This country, the various communities that currently make up Nigeria, the different polities, pre-colonial polities, and even our post-independence history has a lot of bearing on the development or lack of development of this country. Every single issue that becomes a concern, either developmental, security, or in terms of the integration of the country, you will find examples from Nigerian polities that had encountered and addressed these challenges in their history. We have had communities that had fought wars, that had built alliances, that had built peaceful relations among them. And contrary to the picture of African societies or African polities as perpetually at war with themselves, the vast majority of African societies had interacted peacefully among themselves. So a teaching of history will basically impart in our citizens a sense of the importance of the past, a sense of the inevitability of the various communities that make up Nigeria coming together to live in peace, and a belief in the fact that our togetherness is better for each and every group than all this fractiousness and divisive politics that we are going through. So most of the polities that made up Nigeria, whether in the northern Sahel or tropical rainforest in the west, in the south, were heterogeneous, multicultural, and in fact, several of them were multi-religious. But they were able to come together and build very big empires and kingdoms, some of them that lasted for several centuries. So were there conflicts among them? Yes, there were. But those conflicts were literally international conflicts between sovereign states rather than the quote-unquote ethnic and tribal conflicts as projected by Western anthropologists, and historians and so on and so forth. So teaching of history will give our young persons, and in fact, even citizens not very well educated in the history of their country, a sense of the importance or a sense of belonging in their own communities, and a sense of inevitability or the utility of a large, unified, and strong Nigeria. We can draw examples as we go on, on the history of the previous kingdoms and empires as to how they relate to contemporary Nigerian history.
We'll come back to that, but at this stage, viewers, we'll take a short break. We'll be right back. Welcome back, viewers, as we continue our discussion on history as a public good. Professor Kiari Mohammed, the teaching of history in Nigeria, where did we go wrong?
Well, it's not so much the teaching of history itself, but it's more like a government policy that says history will no longer be taught as part of the curriculum in primary and secondary schools. So there's nothing wrong with the teaching of the subject itself, but once government took that decision, again, to replace history with civic education for political reasons, political and ideological reasons. One, the choice of civic education was more one as a result of fear by military administration, first in 2009, which saw history as one of those quote-unquote subjects that was conducing to radicalization of young persons and students. They were looking into the activist schools, like you said, like the Zaria school, which arose from the Dar es Salaam tradition, you know, with leanings to the left, very activist, revolutionary, that was deeply involved in the struggle for liberation of countries in Southern Africa, that was asking questions and had no problem getting involved in the direction of the country itself, and was questioning at some point the utility or legitimacy of the military regime itself. Then this also, they found an ally in the IMF and the World Bank, which also thought that the teaching of history is not of much utilitarian value. In fact, they not only were not happy with the teaching of history, but they didn't even think it important for people or children in African countries to be taught anything beyond basic education. So several things. At the political front, this rejection of liberalism and the structural adjustment program and other policies of the Bretton Woods system seriously shook Nigerian authorities, particularly the military regime of General Babangida. That military regime was very conscious of its direction, and it was one regime that also attempted to write its own history, because President Babangida, if anything, was cleverly trying to rewrite the history of Nigeria with a prominent role for his administration. So an uncensored study of history will not allow for that. So rather than allowing the various tendencies to contest, they opted for completely removing history from our school curriculum. It took the intervention, of course, of the Historical Society of Nigeria, advocacy, lobbying, and whatever it took. It took more than 10 years for a civilian administration to agree, even in principle, to reintroduce history in 2020. So in terms of the teaching of history, it's not much the teaching, but it's just
The politics.
the policy and the politics of what should be taught and what should not be taught. So, of course, in a democratic setting, citizens, but particularly the guilds, the academic guilds, and the institutions should be the one to draw up the content and the curricula of what should and what should not be taught. I'm sure you are aware of as from 1988 through 1990, when government cracked down on radical scholars in our universities, including dismissal of some, deportation of others, when the idea basically was that some of them were teaching what they were not paid to teach.
I was actually teaching Marxism in Ahmadu Bello University, and that was one of the main courses that the military cancelled.
So,
but we bounced back.
So basically, you can see. So the idea of the university is based on the concept of individual freedom and university autonomy. The decision of what should be taught is that of the Senate of the university. How it should be taught is a decision of the faculty who is teaching that course. But of course, the job of the university and any other agency is to ensure that these courses are taught and taught properly. And like you said, if you are teaching Marxism, any good scholar will also know that the divergence of opinion is accepted in the university system. You will still find students who will come to you to say, no, this thing is not working, and for free enterprise. So, but we had a situation where, no, some opinions should not contest. So this was the situation we were in.
At this point, we need to move to your own home community, Borno. I know your PhD thesis was on Borno, the Rabe years. What was that about? Tell us a bit about your findings.
The Rabe years in Borno was a very short period of only 7 years between 1893 and 1900. It's a period remembered very well in the oral history of Borno. One, because it was not too long ago, but more because of the depredations, the hardships, the war, famine, and the general difficulty that the Borno polity went through in those 7 years. Rabi Paral Allah was a Sudanese slave raider, marauder, conqueror who left Sudan in the late 1880s, plundered and ravaged several states on his way, including the Bahr al-Ghazal region of Sudan, areas around Darfur, Darunga, Wadai, and Fezzan in Kanem, some parts of Central Africa, and conquered Borno in 1893. Now, the conquest of Borno led to the defeat of the El-Kanemi dynasty, and for the next 7 years, Rabi established some form of administration, but unfortunately, because he was a plunderer all his life, was unable to develop an economy to sustain the state. So he plundered the state. Borno's neighbors, particularly the eastern emirates of the Sokoto Caliphate, blockaded Borno because the intelligence available to them was that after Borno, Rabi's next target was the Sokoto Caliphate. So the Rabi years were very difficult. The rulers of the Borno kingdom were defeated. Shehu Hashimi, the ruling Shehu, was defeated in battle. He was killed in battle. At least two of his successors, a Shehu named Kyari, was also killed in battle. And for the next 7 years, Rabi depredated. Depredations continued. It took the arrival of the French, who had the Lake Chad as their mission, the Rendezvous du Chad. It consisted of 3 missions: one from North Africa, one from Senegal, one from Congo, from Brazzaville. And by 1900, they wanted to link all of their colonial possessions. The only thing that stood in their way was Rabi. So Rabi was engaged in several military battles. On the 22nd of April of 1900, he was killed in a place that the French named Port Lamy, after Major Lamy, one of the martyrs of the French expedition, which is now N'Djamena. So basically, for the history of Borno, if you talk about the crisis that Borno is going through today in terms of the Boko Haram crisis, they will tell you we've gone through the Rabi period. The late Professor Mohamed Nur Al-Kali was one of those who was saying Borno shall rise again because it cannot be worse. Whether Boko Haram is worse than Rabi or it comes close to it is basically a matter of opinion. But there's also a discourse, particularly among traditional historians that believe in the cyclical view of history, that every 100 years that there is something that happens in the history of Borno. In fact, I've interviewed people who told me that it was believed that every 100 years something will happen. And they will give you examples of either famine, drought, or a major catastrophe or cataclysm that has happened. And they see, depending on who is interpreting, first they saw the Rabi invasion as one. Second, they saw British colonization of Borno as one. And when the Boko Haram insurgency began, they also saw that as part of the cycles. So for us, Borno has had the history of both the good, the bad, and the ugly. And the Rabi years was one of the worst in our contemporary history. Borno fell because it was an independent state. So the postulation will be that if Borno, as currently constituted, were an independent country of its own, it will have completely been taken over by Boko Haram. But she is part of the Nigerian Federation. So there's a problem in a part of Nigeria. Boko Haram is unable to overrun Nigeria. But the 14 or so local governments that were under Boko Haram occupation in 2013-14, if it were an independent state, you could say, well, yes, Boko Haram is close to Rabi. In terms of their extremist views, Rabi presented himself as part of the Sudanese Mahdiya. But scholars of the Mahdiya will tell you that he used the Mahdiya as an ideological posture and in order to gain legitimacy, but that he was himself not a Mahdist, and that when the Mahdist movement was in trouble while he was on his way to Borno and they sought his help, he did not go back to help. An attempt by some local Mahdiya groups like that of Hayatu bin Said in neighboring Adamawa to link up with him, did not end up well. So just like Boko Haram lays claim to Islam, Rabi himself also laid claim to some version of Islam distinct from that of Borno. But for me, it was basically an ideological position. If you are going to fight a predominantly Muslim population, you needed to come up to ensure or to make the vast majority of them infidels and to make it legitimate for you to spill their blood. Otherwise, you will be seen for the tyrant that you are rather than being a reformer or a messiah.
I know that over the past 15 years, you've been studying very closely the Boko Haram movement. Do they draw any historical parallels from the history of Borno, or they are simply based on the theocratic argument and draw from the Quran?
I have seen a few attempts to link Boko Haram to a fax Bornoana, but they did not at any point in time lay claim to a glorious Borno fast or a glorious Canon Borno pass that they intend to reenact. If anything, they say Borno is version of Islam, mostly based on the Sufi tradition, as an impure version of Islam. So, but of course, do they, if anything else, in some of their sermons, particularly Muhammad Yusuf has made several references to the jihad in Sokoto. Usman Danfodio, Abdullahi Bello, the leaders of the jihad, they were themselves Sufis. They did not come from the Salafi, or modern day Wahhabi traditions, but they had questioned the existing other Sufi version of Islam in most parts of northern Nigeria. So they do lay claim, it's an appropriation if you want to, of the Sokoto jihad, even though they have issues with the leadership of the Sultan, who is a direct heir from the leaders of the jihad in Sokoto. Yes, we like Usman Danfodio. Yes, he led a jihad because they believe they are also leading a jihad. Yes, he came to purify an impure version of Islam. That's what they claim they are doing. So to that extent, they take inspiration from Sokoto. But even with Sokoto, that is where it ends. And of course, if you study the history of Borno closely, at about the time that the jihad was ongoing in Sokoto, Borno was itself had in Muhammad Al-Kanemi, an Islamic scholar who question the genuineness or the religiosity of the leaders of the Sokoto Caliphate because of the 1808 attack of the capital of Birnin Gazargamu, the Borno capital. Al-Kanami's arguments were, we understand, yes, you are doing a jihad, we have nothing against your jihad, but why attack Borno, a Muslim state? And he went to the extent of saying, okay, when you overran our capital, Birnin Gazargamu, didn't you pray in the mosques that you found? Or what did you find? Did you find synagogues and churches? Were they not mosques? And of course, the argument of the leaders of Sokoto was that Borno was aiding some of the Hausa states, particularly states like Katsina. And Borno was that we are in treaty with Katsina to assist and to protect them in terms of attack. So it was more like we have an obligation. So it's not like you will know more than anybody else that Islam is not homogeneous. There are tendencies within Islam, and different scholars and different religious groups have different interpretations on the same issue. So there are lessons to be learned, but Boko Haram did not lay claim to anything from the history of Borno. If anything else, Yusuf and the early leaders of Boko Haram were, no. Ours is not a local Borno thing. In fact, it is not a Kanuri thing. That the Brotherhood of Islam, that anybody who is our member, all members are equal irrespective of your ethnicity. An attempt to draw in the non-Kanuri ethnic minority groups, particularly those on the Mandra Mountains and the hills around Goza, into the movement. And once you remove the Kanuri foot soldiers around Maiduguri and Bama, the vast majority of the followers of Yusuf, came from the Goza axis. And this was because of the extensive recruitment and this idea that ethnicity is not important. It is your belief, it is your fighting. And of course, that's what Islam preaches. But
so you don't really think this story is about a Kanuri factor in Boko Haram movement is historically or sociologically accurate?
No, it's not. It's completely false. The only Kanuri factor you can find in Boko Haram, let me put it that way, is that Yusuf is Kanuri. He spoke Kanuri and Hausa very fluently, and he had a smattering of Fulfulde. So he lived, preached, and recruited in urban Maiduguri for at least 6 years before the insurrection in 2009. So, and there was a large following of out of school young persons, largely excluded from society, who were available for recruitment. So my argument has always been that Yusuf's location and recruitment determined the membership of Boko Haram. I always tell people, perhaps if he had, their original mission, their first place of choice was Kano, but apparently they opted for Maiduguri because maybe of the ethnic factor. If he had proselytized in Kano, like Muhammad Marwa in 1980, the vast majority of his followers are likely to have been Kano people, not Kanuri people. So it was location, and the fertile ground exists. The conditions in Borno Sokoto, Zamfara, Kebbi, Kano are basically the same in terms of the socioeconomic indices.
Absolutely.
You
We
know,
have just
yeah, that's right.
we have just 2 more minutes, and I'd want you to conclude with the recent happenings. There's been a lot of Boko Haram elements that are giving up the struggle and surrendering to the Nigerian state. Are we finally seeing the end of the Boko Haram movement?
The large-scale defection is a good sign that we are making progress in the fight against Boko Haram, but we are not yet there. A few things account for this. One was that, yes, the Nigerian state, and particularly the Nigerian military, have done a heavy blow to Boko Haram, particularly the group led by Abubakar Shekau, which depleted his resources, which made it easy for the rival group, the ISWAP, further north, to assist the Nigerian state in decapitating that group. So the large-scale defection is one. Members of the Shekau group unwilling to go back to the rival group, and two, the success of the military campaign by the Nigerian state, particularly the blockading, of their areas which have completely been denuded of food and resources. So even if they live in those communities, there is no food because they engage in a scorched earth campaign, the Boko Haram themselves. They denuded the neighboring communities of food. So if they don't lose to the bullets of the Nigerian military, hunger and malnutrition is likely to finish them up. So what Nigeria ought to do is to manage those who have successfully come out with a view to bringing in those who are still in the bush. This is one strategy. But in conflicts like this, no matter how hard the fight, a people who believe in the justness, quote unquote, of their cause, is going to be difficult to defeat them in battle. So we'll have to still look for some non-military conclusion to the Boko Haram fight. But it's a good sign that it's not going to be as long.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor Kyari Mohammed. Viewers, we've had a fascinating conversation with Professor Kyari Mohammed on the importance of history as a public good. It is the study and knowledge of history that can help us build a nation we can all feel we belong to, that we are proud of. Well, I'm happy that since 2000, the Nigerian state has agreed that the teaching of history can resume in our primary and secondary school. Let's hope that in practice that happens. Have a good day.